Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Kathy Schluter, and I am a member of the Racial Diversity Team of the United Methodist Church of Whitefish Bay. I am pleased to welcome you back to the 7th installment of our Racism in America speaker series. Tonight, we are pleased to bring back Brady Henderson, who gave a fascinating presentation on From Jim Brown to Jim Crow in week 2. Tonight, we will hear an equally impactful presentation on racism and the criminal justice system. Brady is a civil rights attorney and is the founder of the law firm Cream City Law in Milwaukee. He served as a legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union in Oklahoma and as an assistant district attorney. Brady has been actively involved with and presented on racial justice issues for many years. Please join me in welcoming Brady Henderson. Take it away, Brady.
All right, thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? Can we get some hands up? How about that? Okay, that works, good. I always try to make sure I'm not echoing. So, briefly, just Kathy, I never promise that it's going to be equally impactful. That's important. It's like the sequel to a movie. I don't say it's going to be as good, just maybe, mostly as good. So let's have managed expectations here. In all seriousness, though, some of what we'll cover tonight is a little bit scary and a little bit disturbing, but frankly, so is this whole series. That's why we're doing it, is to confront things that we often, frankly, don't really think about, and we really should. And from many years spent working within different facets of the criminal justice system itself, or efforts to understand it or reform it, one of the big takeaways I've had for many years is actually how little many of us out there really understand what goes on, and yet how much it impacts our lives. And so I'm going to try to share my screen and do a little of this through some PowerPoint as well. If it doesn't work, let me know, but hopefully we will all now see. Kathy, can you give me a thumbs up if we have all right, sounds good. So remember, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So, bear that in mind. However, I want to use PowerPoint tonight really for the same reason we often do for these, so that we have some things that are easy to see and not just to hear, because we have some complicated things to understand. And what I want to do tonight is try to keep this as short as I can so that we have lots of time for questions and discussions, and really focus on key things that I think most people aren't aware of in the system itself. We've been studying race through this entire series, and a lot of what I'm going to do tonight is not talk just about race and criminal justice itself and how they come together, but really understanding all of these different facets of the system so that it's easier for us to apply what we've been discussing and learning and becoming more aware of, really discovering throughout these weeks. So one of the key things we often forget is how hard it can be to just map the criminal justice system itself. And that is literally just who's a part of it. What is it? Well, first of all, it's something that literally employs in the millions of people. It touches virtually every aspect of our lives and has a lot of players. So I'll start with the obvious ones that I think many of us would think of, but perhaps not think fully about just how pervasive or diverse they are. Of course, often the first player that we'll see in the criminal justice system from the perspective of someone who is on the business end of it, accused or potentially ultimately convicted of a crime, is law enforcement. And that, of course, can be local, county, state, federal, or specialized law enforcement. And one of the things I want to talk about there just a minute is how many of us don't realize just how many layers of policing are over any of us at any given time. Right now, virtually any of us on this particular Zoom meeting have a local police force that has jurisdiction over us right now, a county sheriff's department, a state police force, a federal, well, several, particularly the FBI being the main one. There is actually a federal police force having to do with federal property, and various other specialized entities ranging from alcohol, tobacco, and firearms departments to things like the TSA, to things like the Drug Enforcement Administration. And just like law enforcement itself, the amount of law out there has actually ballooned since the US really was formed, since we became a country. At any given time now, any of us is under probably conservatively 100,000 pages of criminal law that we could potentially violate. And I'm really not exaggerating that number. That's actually very true. Now, of course, part of that is due to the fact that, let's face it, when the government's writing laws, they're not always the most succinct and concise. Anyone who's ever had to look up a little bit of tax code can verify that. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is that, as I'll explain more later, the criminal justice system tends to grow rather than shrink. But for now, let's look at the other players. We've got jailers and bailers, and that is the people responsible for what happens after a person gets arrested. And in America, we basically have two tracks: the track that leads to jail and the track that leads to bail or getting released. And as we'll see later, that is one of the places, too, that's less obvious, where things often diverge by race. Then after that, we have prosecutors, assistant district attorneys, attorneys general, folks such as US attorneys in the federal system, prosecutors that can be in tribal courts on reservations, and their counterparts, defense attorneys. Then we have the judges and the juries who actually handle the cases. And one thing that may surprise many folks on this call is how much bigger the judges are part of it than the juries. I probably should have put them maybe in a different font, for instance, and made juries really small on the PowerPoint, because of it. Throughout the criminal justice system, in an average court docket, you will see roughly 95 to 98% of cases handled by some form of plea bargaining or judicial hearing without a jury ever actually being involved. And yet, for those like me who have studied law, we're often told from the beginning that the jury is this cornerstone of American justice. And indeed, it was a cornerstone for the founders. It was one of the most important rights enshrined in the Constitution. And yet it is largely absent from the criminal justice system at the present time. And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So then we get to everybody who comes into the equation after a person is potentially convicted or otherwise under a sentence in some way. And that's probation officers, both public and private, local, county, state, federal. All of these have separate sets. And then we have social workers and service providers, physicians, psychiatrists, you name it. And literally, as a nation, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of folks in those departments that deal almost exclusively with folks in the criminal justice system. And then finally, public and private prison operators. And I would not be surprised if there are a few of us on the call tonight, a few on the call, who may actually look at the phrase private prison operator and wonder, what exactly am I referring to? And we'll get to that. It's something that, again, is a rather lesser known facet of how the system actually works. But I think the biggest thing to understand, and it's a critical part of understanding why race interacts the way it does with our system here in America, is that a criminal justice system in and of itself is about stabilizing and protecting things. It's not really so much about safety exactly. Yes, that's what a cop on the street is for, but you don't need a court for that. What the court is about is preserving and protecting a sense of what our society is and what our values are. And I hinted at this a little bit in my last presentation in terms of, the ways we define things like success, or what it means to be normal, or means to be desirable in America, or okay, so to speak, what's on the right side of the tracks or on the wrong side of the tracks. But one of the biggest ways in which the criminal justice system ends up being something that can have incredibly racist impact, sometimes without anyone in it having racist design even, is because it's designed to preserve a status quo. It's designed to preserve historical things about how society works. And in America, we have a history that involves systemic racism, and lots of it. To put it into perspective, what I mean by preserving the status quo, one of the most basic things the criminal justice system does is the simple idea that for you or for me, you know what? I own my car and I'm going to own it tomorrow. Nobody can steal it and say it's theirs, and then I can't do anything about it. I know there's a system of laws that tells me I have ownership rights to that car, that tells me nobody can steal it, and tells me if they do, there are things that can happen for me to get it back and them to be held accountable. That's what I mean by preserving the status quo. It's really about preserving rights. And for many of us, that's the right to property, the right to livelihood, that sort of thing, the right to autonomy. So to that end, the system deals with basically two types of crimes. And I'm going to actually throw some Latin out here because let's have it somewhere. Let's have it at the beginning, and then I promise I won't do any more. But there are two kinds of crimes that every single thing in the system can be boiled down to one of these two. And the first one is called a malum in se. And it's a Latin term basically meaning an evil in and of itself. And it's exactly what the term implies. It's something where it's bad, not just because somebody who wrote the law says it's bad, but because we all understand as a society, this is a bad thing. Examples would include things like murder, robbery, rape, serious crimes that we know aren't okay, not just because the law says so, but we understand are from something deeper in our sense of morality and identity as a society. Now, most of the crimes on the books, though, and a lot of what people are sentenced for are not an example of malum in se. They're an example of the other type of crime, the type that only starts to exist when government officials start writing laws. And that's called a malum prohibitum. And that is something that basically means it's an evil because it's prohibited. It's something that is bad only because we say you should not do it. And that's something where I'm trying to think of perhaps the simplest way to look at it. Imagine you're on a street and you're looking at the curb and you see two areas of the curb, and one of them says no parking and the other one says parking. Well, parking in the no parking part is a malum prohibitum. There's nothing inherently evil about it. It's just a problem because somebody made that the no parking zone. In other words, it's arbitrary. Doesn't mean it's frivolous. It doesn't mean it's not a good idea. There are mali prohibiti, so to speak, that are incredibly important. The point is, it's what we define it to be as a society. And so even more than things like a malum in se crime, it's going to be subject to our prejudices, to our biases. And again, we'll see where this comes into play later as we're talking about things like drug sentencing and how that affects people of color. Now, let's look at the hardware. We've talked about the purpose of the system. The US system is, I'm not going to say unique, it has been a trendsetter. But one of the things about it that we frankly tend to take for granted here in America is that the backbone of criminal justice is the prison. And what you see before you here is a particular prison. Some of you may recognize it if you're history buffs. This is an old engraving of the original state of Eastern State Penitentiary. And it was a pioneering prison in the American system. This was an early prison in Pennsylvania. You had some in New York and other places like this that started a little bit after the 19th century got going. And one of the things that we did in the United States as we really created what is now our criminal justice system is relied on prisons and incarceration to an extent that has really never happened before in world history. In criminal justice throughout history, there are a variety of things that have been relied upon to enforce the law, a variety of punishments, so to speak. And not all of those are by any means prison. That's what is really different in the American system. And one of the things that is an interesting confluence in what will be talked about next week, in Matt's presentation, for instance, is this particular facility, Eastern State, the tradition it started of the penitentiary system. It's basically what we call it, that's now been exported to other countries, actually has as its inspiration monasteries. The idea was that you had a lot of folks saying, how do we reform a system that seems to be very much about executing people or beating them or torturing them? How do we focus on reforming people instead of just punishing them? And when they thought of, well, what's an example of something designed to change someone, designed to improve them, designed to help them be introspective and make their life better, particularly designed to help them gain discipline? And they thought of monasteries. And so even the notion of the cell as we know it is actually based on a cell within a monastery that actually are similar as well. Whether you're talking about monks or nuns or any other religious order. That's actually the genesis for where we got to as a system here in the US. And I think it's important for a couple of reasons. One is it gave us this idea that we can incarcerate in ways that are going to change people for the better. And we didn't always really police ourselves to figure out, is that actually going to be true? And secondly, it helped reinforce the idea that the criminal justice system is a moral force. And again, in a nation where we have a history of racism, that moral force is going to sometimes flow in the direction of that very racism. Now, to talk a little bit about the prison in more detail, part of what has changed in America, particularly in the last century, is the so-called modern prison is now a melting pot. So we now incorporate people into prisons or into jails in some kinds that used to be sent to workhouses, mental health institutions, who used to just flat be tortured or beaten or whipped. People who used to go to penal colonies or be banished from a country, and very much people who used to be executed. The system we inherited as a country from the British heavily, from other sources very much, of course, as well. But it was something that didn't just rely on prisons, it relied on a variety of things, ranging from corporal punishment to execution for crimes very much in excess of murder, which is typically the only crime other than sort of high treason that can get you a death sentence these days. And then we also have taken something else into our prisons, and that is populations that used to be in places like workhouses or mental health institutions. And a workhouse, if you're not as familiar with that term, not as into things like Downton Abbey and that sort of thing, it's a bit more of a British term, is the same kind of concept as a poorhouse. If you think of workhouses and think of the Ebenezer Scrooge line from Dickens, you are right on point. That's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about places to house people we don't know what to do with, in a sense, people who can't seem to be successful or function or support themselves on their own. And in modern America, all of these folks have ended up in prisons and jails, sometimes in adjacent cells, sometimes right together in the same room. Somebody who has murdered, somebody who simply couldn't get their life together. And that has profound implications for how effectively the system ultimately works. One of the most important things that I think I ever learned back when I was an assistant district attorney for many years came to me from one particular judge named Lori Walkley, who had done criminal courts for years. And she took me aside one day and she said, "Brady, do you know who it is we send to jail or send to prison?" She said, "It's three sets of people. It's the people we're afraid of, it's the people we're mad at, and it's the people we don't know what else to do with." And I want you to bear that in mind because it's absolutely accurate. And one of the things I think we can all notice is those are in descending order of effectiveness, or some would say legitimacy, if you will. A couple more things about the system before we get into the nitty-gritty. Kind of like I said with the idea of how penitentiaries came along, people get ideas and they get ideas at different times, and that system changes. One of the things that it's easiest to miss about criminal justice in America is that it's the product of evolution, not intelligent design. The system we had today is not one that one person or one being sat down and designed to all be coherent and all make sense. It's something that accretes over time. New laws get added, new punishments get added or taken away. New things happen that change the priorities for people. And that system will reflect it. It's a system, because it's the product of evolution, of success on random variation, that's going to have flaws because there's no intelligent design to try to remove those flaws. Like anything that evolves, it tends to grow more than it tends to shrink, which is a feature of things that evolve, and it has trends. Even though this is a system that is a stalwart, if you will, that slows things down, right? It preserves the status quo. So the whole idea is, how do we slow things down? It's still a system that is very much subject to fads and trends. And perhaps the way I would illustrate that is, imagine, for instance, the long-standing norm that, okay, and by the way, there's no connotation intended here having to do with traditional gender roles or anything LGBTQ or anything anti-trans in any way. But I think we'd all understand, traditionally, we think of skirts or dresses as things that are worn by females. So that would be an example of a long-standing tradition or trend, kind of like the long-standing purposes of the criminal justice system. But what happens every season? Within that bigger norm, okay, we know there are folks who we expect to wear a skirt or wear a dress. Well, what changes every season though? What color is in? What the skirt lengths are this year? What style? What fabric? Criminal justice works the same way. Often we are reaching towards these same basic priorities and traditions, but everybody's trying to do it in their own way. And because of that, it evolves constantly. And it also means that there is a great potential to actually reform that system and to change it. So let's get into a little more nitty-gritty here. And I think a good place to go now is to talk about the first step in that system often, and that's jails. This graph is not perfect on being able to be read. I apologize on that. It is from a source I particularly respect. But I want to give you an idea of even the growth in basic jail and jailing that we have seen since about, this is from 1983 to about 2013. It happens to be a particularly good set of data. I know it's a little bit old. But the point is, one of the things that this shows is just how many more people were even sticking in jail. And that's a very good indicator because it's the front end of the system. First of all, for those who are ultimately going to go to prison or probation for serious crimes. But perhaps just as importantly, it also shows us the rise of sentencing to jail. Because if you're sentenced to jail, it's very likely you are what we would often term within the criminal justice system, a low-level offender. You're not Al Capone. You are not Jeffrey Dahmer. You're somebody who probably has a history of too many OWIs. You're somebody who maybe has a history of too many bar fights. You're somebody who can't get off of drugs, things like that. So one of the things this graph shows is if you look back at the beginning of the data, in this case 1983, you'll see that the total number of people, and this is a national figure, kind of what we call jail day average, you had about 100,000 people, about 112,000 actually, who would have been in pretrial detention, sitting in a jail cell waiting for whatever's next in America. You go to its peak in 2008, and that number becomes nearly 500,000. One of the things that we're going to look at in more detail in a few minutes, one of the greatest trends, and I don't mean greatest as in good, I mean biggest, one of the biggest trends that criminal justice in America has seen has largely occurred after approximately 1980 through about 2010 or 2015. And that is an absolute explosion in the numbers of people who have gone into the criminal justice system and who have been incarcerated. And with that explosion has come incredible racial disparities as well. And the reason this is important, other than the obvious, that we don't necessarily want extra people to be incarcerated inherently, there are things sometimes that we miss in that analysis too. So if you have, for instance, the peak figure of 439,000 pretrial offenders, the direct cost of that is about $6 billion per year. That's nationally, of course, and that's a drop in the bucket compared to what we're going to see in a minute from prisons. But it's not just the cost of paying jailers and paying for food and that sort of thing. It's the cost of everything that is lost when someone ends up in jail instead of working a job or supporting their family. It's likely that when those are included, that figure is roughly doubled. And that doesn't include then all the money that comes from everything else in the court system. Overall, criminal justice is actually one of the costliest things we do in America. And part of why we don't often see that cost is it's spread along that entire spectrum of local, county, state, federal, and various things within the federal system. So the cost is largely invisible, as are the numbers in many cases. Long term, the more people we tend to have incarcerated does a lot of things. First of all, it pushes down jury trials, and it makes a difference. And we'll get to bail in a minute, but think about it this way. If we're putting more people in jail right from the beginning, and we're going from a system in which somebody can potentially defend their case, if we say, yes, you're innocent until proven guilty, fine and good, but if I'm sitting in a jail cell, that's different very quickly. Do I really have the ability to handle being in that jail 6 months, a year, 18 months, waiting on my trial to be completed? Or do I have a very powerful incentive to enter a plea, accept, for instance, a short prison sentence, whether or not I'm guilty of the crime or whether or not I may have an excuse? Part of this trend in putting so many more people in jails and building far bigger jails is directly related to the fact that we only have about 2 to 5% of all cases actually go to trial anymore. When you build bigger jails and you put more people in them, you have far fewer jury trials. Now, if you're somebody who really hates jury duty, okay, this is not necessarily a bad thing for you. But the problem is pretty much you and everyone else end up paying a lot more for it in the long run. And it's something that has been a powerful impact throughout our country. In the jurisdiction I was even in back in Cleveland County, Oklahoma, when I was a prosecutor, I had a docket that was amongst the most litigious, the most trials, because I did domestic violence cases where things were much more hotly contested. It wasn't as simple in terms of proving a case as showing here was the BAC you blew after you were pulled over, or here's the lab test on the cocaine that was in your possession. Very often it came down to things like eyewitness testimony and scant physical evidence. Even then, I hardly ever did a jury trial. I probably did one jury trial for every 100 cases I handled. And that is common throughout the United States at almost any level. So one of the other things that I want to talk about here is how incarceration starts to affect people, though. And you'll see I put a little line here that talks about the fact that outcomes rapidly degrade after 48 hours in jail. What do we mean by outcomes? Well, what we mean is really this. It has to do with what actually happens when you put a person into the criminal justice system. And I'm going to present you with a picture you probably were not expecting to see in a presentation on race and criminal justice, because on its surface, it has absolutely nothing to do with race and criminal justice. This is a picture for, some of you may recognize this if you're streaming TV buffs. It's actually from HBO's series on Chernobyl. It's not quite the real Chernobyl, but it's a very good recreation of it. And for those of you who are less familiar with the TV series, you're likely to be familiar with the actual event, a disaster of incredible proportions that occurred in what is now the Ukraine in 1986. So what the heck does this have to do with race and criminal justice? Well, it's this. It's probably one of the biggest illustrations of what we call a positive feedback loop. Now, a positive feedback loop sounds like something I want to have, right? It sounds like something where maybe I'm getting positive feedback every day. Brady, you're doing a great job. And I get a little happier and I get more excited and everything gets a little better. No, that really isn't how it works at all. What a positive feedback loop is a system where when the system starts to fail, it actually makes it fail worse. And the reason I brought up Chernobyl is it's actually a really good illustration of that. You see, the way that everybody but the Soviet Union designed its nuclear reactors was with a thing that was called water moderation. And it meant that water was in them to cool them down, and water actually helped make the reaction possible. The reason that was important was that if the water all leaked out or flashed into steam because the reactor overheated, it meant it would shut itself down. It wouldn't work anymore. So it was an inherently safer system. The reason Chernobyl happened is some folks in the Soviet Union who were trying to figure out how to do things cheaper and didn't really care too much about the safety, designed theirs differently. And they designed a system where the water still cooled the reactor, but it also actually slowed down the nuclear reaction so that if all leaked out or it all flashed to steam because the thing overheated, instead of it shutting down, it would actually exponentially increase the reaction. It would run away, essentially, which is exactly what turned an industrial power plant in the Ukraine into a bomb. That's one of the greatest examples in history of a positive feedback loop. What it really means is something that reinforces itself. And our criminal justice system is full of these. The one that guys like me used to talk about all the time when we were on the inside of it as prosecutors, police talk about it, judges talk about it, is what we often just call the spiral. And the spiral is basically what happens when somebody who is already, let us say, circling the drain of life, starts getting on the business end of the criminal justice system. And here's, perhaps a simple way to illustrate it, at least simpler than the nuclear physics. So imagine your person who, or imagine it's someone you know, if that's easier, or someone you know of, who starts maybe gets an OWI, makes a mistake, drives drunk, gets his or her license suspended, but is already in a situation where maybe this person is not financially in particularly good shape and they're struggling to do things like hold down a job. Well, what happens once the system becomes involved is, yes, a lot of good things for accountability, but also a lot of things that create this positive feedback loop. Because one of the things we tend to know about crime generally is that the more people have financial desperation, the less they have opportunity, the fewer options they have, the more crime there is. And when you start getting a system involved, you can very quickly start to limit a person's options, limit a person's opportunities, and increase their desperation. When we talk about the spiral, often we're talking about that in terms of things like being in jail, so you lose your job because you're in jail, or having to suddenly pay fines and assessments or other costs that you frankly don't have the money for, which increases all kinds of things that can lead to more crime. And what it means is that often when you have a person who is perhaps a first-time offender, they found themselves within the system is basically set up in a way that it actually makes it often more likely that they go down the drain. And what I mean by going down the drain is going from somebody who, unfortunately, in their life has to spend a weekend in jail, maybe a couple of times, has to be on probation, has to pay some fines, has to have some things that are unpleasant, but fundamentally can still live their life, can still provide for a family, can still function in society. Going down the drain means going from that to somebody who is long-term incarcerated, who spends much of their life in prisons or in or out of prisons or other facilities. And one of the things that many of us who have been part of the system have seen time and time again is that not only applies to a person, but it applies to whole families. Many of you may have heard a term that has become more popular in about the last 10 years called generational poverty. And it's poverty that's passed down through generations, where opportunities shrink so much that it takes more than one generation to come out of it, that it predisposes somebody's offspring to a very poor lot in life. Generational incarceration is the same basic concept, and it actually is not uncommon at all. When I was a prosecutor, there were whole families that I prosecuted, and I knew the dad, and I knew the son, and I knew the brother, and I knew the daughter, etc. And one person's choices set the tone for everybody's, partially because of the opportunities it tended to reduce. Excuse me. So that's what the spiral is all about. And the reason I wanted to load all that at the beginning is to give all of you a picture of what it really means when we're going to talk about how the system affects opportunities, not just for people in general, but particularly for people of color. And I'm going to see if hopefully this will work, right? Yes, I think that's right. Hopefully everybody's screen should have just gotten much brighter. If it didn't, let me know. But I actually wanted to do this through a PDF rather than PowerPoint for a minute, because there happens to be a document, a fact sheet from the Sentencing Project, a national organization that has some really, really useful stuff. And it happens to have it in a really good order. So I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I want to talk a little bit about how this system has grown first. And what you can see in front of you is trends in US corrections. And this is actually clear back to 1925 to 2018. And it's the state and federal combined prison population. And if that graph looks like it grows really big in about 1980, you're exactly right. My apologies if it's not the easiest to see the years. On the left side is 1925. 2018 is on the right, and when you see the mountain climbing start is about the year I was born, around 1980. So between 1925 and 2018, the population of the United States increased about 250%, but our prison population increased about 14,000%. And this was the result of a variety of things, the biggest of which is really two trends that started happening around 1980. And one of them is what we often simply ascribe to the war on drugs. not the part with Nancy Reagan doing PSAs saying, just say no, not the red ribbon campaign, but the side of it that saw this incredible explosion of jail and prison sentences for drug offenders. An explosion of sentencing that went from sending somebody to jail for a few weeks to putting them in prison for years for possessing, in some cases, marijuana, in others, cocaine or crack, for instance. And we're going to revisit the distinction between cocaine and crack. We'll talk about that in more detail because it actually has incredible importance to how things work racially in the American criminal justice system. But this is the trend. And this is why so many people are so up in arms too about the system having gone out of control, about it becoming counterproductive. Because anytime you have a population increase of 250% and then a prison increase of 14,000%, either something is very wrong in how you're approaching criminal justice, or people are just getting a whole lot worse, or maybe both, right? So here's where that puts the US. And I'll try to zoom in a little bit more on this. Hopefully that will help us get just a little bit better here. So this is rates of incarceration per 100,000. This is actually boiling it down to more like a percentage. How many people in the US do we actually keep in a prison versus just be out in the world? Well, the United States rate on that is 655 people for every 100,000 of us, which in raw proportion is not huge, but when compared to other countries is. And it makes us see just how, let's say, out of whack we've gotten. So the US incarceration rate is 655. The closest nation to that is El Salvador with 618, then Rwanda with 464, then Russia with 383, then Brazil with 333, and then we're really at the consolation prizes. Australia goes down to 172 per 100,000. In other words, the US has an incredibly large percentage of people in prisons compared actually to literally anywhere else in the entire world. Now, for those of you who have a great deal of national pride or really hate El Salvador for some reason, by all means take stock that we have beaten them at incarceration. They're a close second, but we've won. However, that comes at a great price. This is probably not a statistic where you want your country to be number one, or frankly, even in the top 5 or 6, if not the top 10. It's something that is enormously costly, but also fundamentally antithetical to the image of ourselves that we portray to the rest of the world. We portray ourselves as a country and we want to believe as a nation that we're a nation of freedom. And yet more of our people are actually behind bars than anywhere else. So this trend is only starting to reverse. And in fact, to go back here to this top graph, you can see when it basically peaked around 2008. And actually, I'll stay at this graph for a minute to talk about why it peaked when it did. One of the things that I think is least known amongst people who are not on the inside of the criminal justice system is that it's fundamentally capacity driven. It's not actually driven by direct considerations of public safety or morality or accountability or victims' rights. How many people one seems to need to put in jail as a prosecutor or a judge tends to be proportional to how many jail beds there are available. And that's also true of prisons. Well, what else happened in 2008 besides the peak of this graph? Well, the Great Recession, the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage meltdown that fundamentally altered things economically for the entire country, and in particular, massively affected revenue streams that actually affected state budgets directly. And suddenly there was an incredible call to reduce this capacity and reduce all the per diem money that was being paid for jails and prisons. And that has continued to this day. And it's continued partially, frankly, because of guys like me. Because around that same time, many of us who had been advocates for reform, who believed for moral reasons that the system shouldn't be how it is, started trying to well, I shouldn't say started, finally were successful at figuring out how to get allies who otherwise weren't listening to those arguments. And what we found is that often those who are most concerned about criminal justice being out of control or flaws in the system were on the left of the political spectrum, or at least left of center. And it was harder often to get folks on the right on board because you tend to have more rhetoric, you tend to have more tough on crime perspective amongst folks who are more conservative. And what we finally figured out is, well, even if when we tell a particular story of someone we think was unjustly sentenced and it doesn't seem to be as effective, well, what happens if we take all of these numbers of prisoners and then we actually look at how much money is paid every day, taxpayer money, to make all this possible? And of course, what we figured out pretty quickly is for those who maybe criminal justice isn't the first issue they come to when they come to the idea of what they want to do to reform government, but if things like lowering spending or taxes is that first idea, what we helped them figure out is that reining in the criminal justice system and mass incarceration is actually one of the most effective ways to do it. What has driven down that population since 2008 is frankly money. And here is why. So let me see if I can zoom in better. My apologies, this is not the best here. Let's see if that will work. Maybe a little too much zoom there. So this is state expenditures on corrections. This is in billions of dollars from 1985 to 2018. It increased tenfold, literally an order of magnitude. Can any of us really think of one other facet of government spending that has increased tenfold in that number of years? It's almost impossible, no matter how cynical any of us happen to be about government spending increases. The only place where that's consistently happened since about 1980 or so is corrections, going from 6.7 billion, for instance, in 85 to almost 61 billion in 2018. And here also, I want to briefly look at one graph to show you a little bit of the melting pot aspect of who is in these prisons and the difference between the different systems. So if you can see this, it's state and federal prison population by offense. And in federal, this is where the war on drugs comes in, because suddenly we have federal prisons that have essentially half their inmates being there for a drug offense. State prisons, most folks are still there with some kind of violent offense on the record. That's where differences in federal policy that started happening, particularly in the 80s, exploded the federal population of drug offenders. There were almost none before that, and particularly in state prisons as well. So finally then, let's go to one other thing, and that is, as big as the prison numbers have exploded, they're not even close to the whole story. So this graph shows what we call population under control of the corrections system, and that's something very different. So back when I was a prosecutor, there were definitely people in cases where we sent them to jail and sent them to prison, but there were far more whom we didn't. We put them on some form of probation. We did things to try to reform them and hold them accountable outside of incarceration, and that is still true in pretty much any jurisdiction. So for instance, in 2016, when you've got a total prison population of about 1.8 billion, at that time, you have got double that only in state probation offenders. In other words, if you take everybody in the system, you go from 1.8 million to 6.6 million. And these are folks who are on parole, on probation, or in county jails. And that's important because for most people, this is actually how they're going to interact with the criminal justice system, not so much by being incarcerated, but by being under probation and parole control. And that can be important for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is it can change how opportunities work. So now let's look at, and I'm going to actually skip through a little bit of the drug specifics, my apologies, and some of the gender specifics, because I think it's about time we got to really looking at race more specifically. And so this is some additional statistics on the racial disparities within that. And these are things that have always been with us in criminal justice, but have been magnified very much by changes in drug policy. So in America, if you're Black, or folks who are Black make up about 13 to 14% of the population on average. but they make up almost 3 times that percentage of prison and jail populations. There is a huge disparity in the numbers of people of color who are incarcerated or even on probation or parole or bail versus those in the general population. And what that changes very quickly is what we call rate of imprisonment. And if I can focus on this top graph for a minute, and again, I'm sorry, I'm not doing the best job of getting these right in the center. So this is, again, a couple of years old now, but it's the closest I can get reliable data. This is rates of imprisonment per 100,000 people. Now, remember when I said as a nation, we have this average of, I think, 655 people per 100,000. Gosh, okay, that's our average. Well, now let's look within that average. So if I'm talking about 100,000 people of any given race, the number is 655. But what if I'm only talking about people who look like me? Only people who are white. Then suddenly that average goes down to 392. And not only would we be beat by El Salvador, Rwanda, and Russia, I mean, we'd barely beat Australia at that point. We'd be in a very different league. The number that changes everything is the number or the rate of Black men who are incarcerated. And that's not 655 for every 100,000. It's 2,272 per 100,000. It's massively different. A similar surge can be seen with those of Hispanic origin, those who are Latino or Latina. It's not as big, but it's very much there. You go from 392 to about 1,000. There are huge disparities in terms of who ends up behind bars or under correctional control and who doesn't. And this is what I love about this particular fact sheet is there's a very good way to illustrate it. So this is what we call lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. And it's something that many of us in criminal justice reform communities and commentators talk about a lot. And it's a way to actually apply that figure to any given person. So any given white guy like me, I've got a 1 in 17 chance of ending up in a prison, which if you think about it is actually pretty darn high. It's still higher in the US than it's going to be most places. But if I were Black, I would have a 1 in 3 chance. If I were Latino, I'd have 1 in 6. If we start putting gender in here, it gets massively bigger. As a Black man, I would have a 1 in 3 chance of ending up in prison in my life. If I'm a white woman, I would have a 1 in 111 chance. Who we incarcerate and who we in fact even put into correctional control is defined incredibly heavily by race. And it happens at virtually every single stage of the process. I was involved actually in some of the data for a report many years ago that ACLU was involved in called Marijuana in Black and White. And this was before many more states have actually legalized or decriminalized various types of medical or recreational marijuana. But what we looked at is usage rates versus arrest and prosecution rates for people of different races, amongst other things. And what we found was that people who were white and people who were Black used marijuana about as often. There was very little difference in usage rates. But someone who's Black had about a 4 times bigger chance nationally, on average, of being arrested for smoking that joint. Had about an 8 times bigger likelihood on average of actually going to jail for it, of ending up incarcerated in some way. And it varied heavily by jurisdiction. In some places, it was 20 to 1. It was rare to find a jurisdiction that wasn't at least 2 to 1. And even today, Wisconsin, in similar metrics of things like incarceration rates of different races, actually ranks very poorly. It tends to rank amongst those with the greatest disparities. So even from the point of things like arrests, there's a difference. And the reason that happens is complicated, and I won't go into every single bit of it, but it happens at every stage. It goes back to things we've been talking about for weeks and discovering and discerning in this series. Things like implicit bias, things like structural differences in how race has affected how people function and how they see each other. And what it means is you tend to have more policing and more arrests in communities of color. You tend to have I'm trying to think how to say it. You tend to frankly have a different paradigm in terms of how sentencing works. You tend to have fewer opportunities amongst communities of color for folks to have just the right defense attorney or just the right ear, or just the right official to get just the right, more lenient treatment by the system. And that starts right from the beginning of policing. And every single stage of that system, of this complex system, also reflects biases, also reinforces, because remember, it's there to preserve and reinforces those same disparities. And that's how we end up with things like 1 in 3 Black men ending up potentially incarcerated in their lifetime. There's one other figure I want to talk about here, and it's just one, but it's what we call felon disenfranchisement and how this relates to a larger picture of race and power. So actually, I'll go back here for a minute. For those of you unfamiliar, most states, in one form or another, have a person who commits a felony lose some aspect of or lose voting rights for some aspect of their life. Sometimes it's for the service of the sentence itself. Sometimes it's basically their whole life. It varies significantly. Here in Wisconsin, for instance, you don't really get your voting rights back until you're essentially done with probation, even after a period of parole. But because of those disparities in the race of who ends up in that system, look at the rate of disenfranchisement that happens because of it. For those who are not African American, the rate of people who would otherwise be eligible to vote who can't is about a little under 2.5%. But for African Americans, it's 3 times that. It's about 7.5%. When you think about, even in a place like Wisconsin, how close something like a presidential election can easily be within 1%. And I don't have the particular graphs right with me here, but I think one of the best analyses was done by actually some colleagues of mine in Florida years ago, and they looked at disenfranchisement there. And at that time, Florida was known, this was kind of in 2012 range, is very much more swing state. It's now swung a bit more red. But at that time, it had gone in rather high profile ways, for instance, helping get George W. Bush elected in the contested election. And they looked at the disenfranchisement figures and how they broke so heavily against African Americans, and that those African Americans tended to vote Democrat much more often. And the numbers they produced showed not only would Florida probably not quite go for a Republican presidential candidate, if you took away that disenfranchisement, it wouldn't even be a swing state. They said it would be a solid blue. That's how big the difference can be in these policy matters. It can change electoral power throughout the country. That's a big, big deal, not just for the direct effects of incarceration, but for the symbolic impact of how that changes people's ideas of power. And so here's where I'm going to try to go back to our PowerPoint. And I'm actually going to go, just because we're running short on time, I'm running a bit behind. I want to talk specifically about what happens when we go beyond prison, and talk specifically about the death penalty just a little bit more. And the reason is twofold. One is because it's of incredible symbolic importance, particularly to the relationship of race and power in criminal justice in America. And also because for many, it actually continues a lot of symbolic traditions from things like lynchings and from the killings of folks who were enslaved. And I want to go through briefly why that is and why people see those differences in it. So the USGAO put out a study a few years ago that was a study of studies trying to find out of everything that we've looked at with race and the death penalty, does it look like things like race of victim or race of an offender makes a difference? And they found in about 4 out of 5 times that it did. And here's kind of the proof in the pudding there. Just like with incarceration, people who are Black represent about 13% of the population, but they represent about 34% of executions. And as a bigger differential of the victims in capital cases, so this would be the victim of the murder that is being punished by execution, over 3/4 of those victims are white. This is what that actually looks like graphically. If you look at it in terms of what we call interracial killings. So this is comparing two things since 1976 and all the capital cases, capital is a death penalty case, that resulted in execution in America. And on the left, the little sort of amber column is the number of cases in which there was a white defendant. So, right, we have a white person who's convicted of the murder for murdering a Black victim, and they received the death penalty and were executed, versus this much bigger graph in red is what happens when you have a Black defendant who has murdered a white victim. So white defendant, Black victim represented only 6.6% of all executions in these cases. When you reverse it so that in theory, our convicted murderer is Black and our murder victim is white, we're now at 93.4% of those cases. The disparity is massive. And the reason it's massive, I think, actually reflects less about how we treat defendants and more about how we treat crime victims. It reflects very old and troubling things in America about how we perceive value. Because the whole idea in the death penalty is one of the value of the victim equating to the life of the defendant, the eye for an eye concept, in other words, though misstated and misused versus the actual biblical concept. But that's the idea, right? So, well, if you take a life, you should have to give your life. But what statistics like this show is that the system habitually views the value of a white life as far more valuable than a Black life. And it's why also when we see folks in the streets with a BLM shirt chanting Black Lives Matter, they're not just talking about what happens with the police. They're not just talking about what happens when someone's arrested. They're talking about this too. This is an enormously important part of the race puzzle, because it's why when we look at the death penalty through the racial lens, we don't just see a neutral institution. We see something that carries on the same kind of traditions as lynchings have. The idea that if you go outside of your place as a person of color, if you hurt someone who's white, if you kill someone who's white, we will be tougher on you, because that, for whatever reason, is still what we fear. The other thing that is, I think I messed up on putting the actual graphic on here. But the other place that this plays out is if you actually look at a map of the states who were slave states going into the Civil War and those that were free states, and you look at a map of who does and does not have the death penalty in their state, every Confederate state has the death penalty. The only two states states in the Union in which a person could own slaves in 1860 have the death penalty. Of the so-called free states in 1860, only two of them actually have the death penalty on the books, and neither of those has had an execution in over 10 years. I think it's Indiana and Ohio, if I remember correctly. Virtually every free Union state abolished the death penalty at some point in its history. The core of death penalty in America is the South, the same place that is the history of chattel slavery and of segregation. That connection is not lost, both inherently on people who are affected by that system and those of us who study it. Ultimately, what we have is a criminal justice system that, because it is the product of evolution and because it's there to preserve what society values, reflects an incredible degree of racism and disparate treatment, not even necessarily because the people within it want to or wanted to in the past, so much as the inherent fact that that system is designed to preserve a society's values. And for most of our history as a country, those values have included the idea that a person of color is often less valuable than a person who is white. But just as evolution can produce that effect, it also makes the system very much amenable to reform. So some of the things I was involved in, for instance, before I left Oklahoma, things like a little thing we called State Question 780 in the state, which was a way to decarcerate incredible numbers of people, in other words, release folks who ended up in prison for minor offenses because of things like what we call 3 strikes, you're outlaws. And those affected predominantly people of color, far more than anybody else. We ultimately were able to pass something, an initiative petition, that completely changed the property crime and drug crime landscape that has now resulted in, it's difficult to say, but probably roughly 20 to 25 million days that somebody of color didn't spend in a jail or prison. And that's something that I think those of us who are part of it are very proud of. But I'm also not saying it just to toot my own horn. I'm saying it because ultimately what made that happen was just people and votes who said, we want to do something different. And so I'll end, at least with the slides here, with, again, another one out of left field. And this is whale oil. And I put it here because I'm curious. I don't think I'm quite officially old yet. I am middle-aged, I am 40. But on the off chance, I'm betting even those of you on this call who would say I'm over the hill probably never lit your house with whale oil. And you probably didn't light it with kerosene. We now power our cars and sometimes light our houses with gasoline. Every time we've made an evolution, something is discarded and something is added. And pretty soon, even this image of a gas pump will probably go away. By the time my kids are driving, or certainly their kids are driving, there'll be a charging station. Things evolve, and we have the capability as people who are ultimately in charge of this system to make those changes, to decide what we want it to be. And there's a couple of pieces of advice that I would give in that regard. And one of them is, for all of us, it's important to make sure that we look beyond the buzzwords, like a politician saying, you know, tough on crime, like someone saying even things like I do. Here, I'll get back to me here. Decarceration, that sort of thing. And understanding what they really mean. And one of the biggest things that can mean, and I'm sorry if anyone's offended by it, but I have a big piece of advice for anybody on this call, and that is go to jail or go to prison. It's up to you. I would not recommend you stay. I would not recommend you go by committing a crime, but I would strongly recommend, because I'll tell you, there are plenty of places who will do this. If you make the right calls, it may take some time, but it is very much possible to go to facilities like prisons, juvenile facilities, even the church here in Whitefish Bay. Neil and the choir have run a thing called the prison choir up until COVID, and actually went down to a juvenile facility. In many of the things I've been part of in the law, I've been able to go to a lot of prisons and a lot of jails. And you don't really understand the system until you actually go to places like that and talk to inmates and see what's going on with your own eyes, to watch what happens in a courtroom. It's one of the most important things, I think, that any of us can actually ever do. And ironically, it's something I already talked to my kids about. We got to get you to a jail sometime. We've got to get you to a prison sometime. The key is don't go to stay. I don't recommend that part. But for those of us who can familiarize ourselves much more with that process, it helps us be able to take numbers like racial disparities and, first of all, start putting faces with them, but also start putting experiences with them as well. And so it's just a little bit after 8. I think this is a good time to go into some question mode, because I know some folks have some questions, and we're trying to hopefully wrap up by about 8:30. I don't know if Kathy is back on or who is moderating that. I can try to do it. Oh, I hear someone, but. Oh.
Yeah, if people have questions, put them in the chat. I have a bunch of questions to get us started, though.
Okay.
One of the questions that I have is, and we talked about this a little bit, Brady, is, we know that prosecutors and judges oftentimes, run for election on a tough on crime, and a lot of politicians do too, but who actually advocate for defendants? There isn't any national association that I'm aware of that would advocate for defendants. And so how do you actually advocate for some of these things?
So there are a couple of different ways that I would approach that. One is that I think that's absolutely true. You don't have defense counterparts to some of the key kind of prosecutorial organizations, or even groups like those behind things like Marsy's Law, right? You don't really have sort of defense equivalents to those. What where you see that advocacy is often from organizations whose members or those that they are working with are affected much more by it. So you tend to see things like the NAACP. You tend to see Black Lives Matter out there talking about it. You see a lot of Native American groups talking about it. Groups like La Raza and other Latino groups. Because it's groups of people where you have whole communities that are disproportionately affected by it. So you often see those organizations out there. But one of the things that I think has actually changed for the better, I think, and will continue to change with a great deal more awareness from folks about racial disparities in the system, flaws in the system, prejudices in the system. The reason that tough on crime has worked for so long, particularly amongst politicians running for offices like district attorney, they have grown up, and for decades it's been this way, really for its whole history, where if you're a DA, the political pressure you fear historically is not political pressure from the defense side. It's from the victim side, right? Or it's from the tough on crime side. You fear people saying, why didn't you put that guy in prison before he killed someone, before he killed this person, right? Or something like that. What has changed, I think, big time in just the last few years is we're starting to see pressure from the other side. We're starting to see a combination of folks who, for moral reasons, reasons of racial equity, sometimes reasons of pure, nothing more than money and wanting to be fiscally responsible, coming at DAs and saying, why did you put this guy in prison? Why did you put this one dude who shoplifted $100 from Walmart in prison for 40 years under a 3 strikes you're outlaw? Why did you do that? Why did you think we needed to warehouse this person, for that long? So that's something that's actually changing, but it still has not found, I think, any sort of overarching organization to it. And one of the hopes I have is that we figure out better ways to do that, because inherently the system benefits a lot from balance. And I think it has its biggest flaws when things get out of balance.
Another question that's out there in the chat is incarceration an intentional strategy of disenfranchisement in some states?
Ooh, I think that's a tough one. I actually think I've seen examples of that intention at times. I would not go so far to say, though, is that that's generally true. I think that comes down to individual intentions of the exact people involved, and they can vary. So you look, for instance, at those who were early supporters of what we came to call the war on drugs. So the history of that involves some people who were probably very well-meaning and really did see crises that were created in people's lives by addiction and things like that. And you had people also in that same movement who were unabashedly doing it for political reasons. There were folks connected with Nixon ultimately, who were looking at the culture wars of the late 1960s and starting to see some writing on the wall for the Republican Party, saying, well, okay, we're figuring out that we have this increasing population of youth, and they tend to be voting more Democratic. They're not voting for folks like Nixon. And what do we do about that? And there are actually documents that have come out gradually over the years of various folks who were analyzing this, actually, I say openly, not publicly at the time, but communicating openly with each other about the political ramifications of that, saying, well, if we can increase drug sentencing, if we can really clamp down on the use of drugs and drug culture, if we can keep some of those folks incarcerated or start getting them at the business end of the criminal justice system, it will weaken our political opponents. So I think there's no question that there are folks who use that under that intention, but I would not make the generalization that that's everybody. I think there are just too many different motivations across the spectrum there.
A similar question in some ways, Ruby's asking, how do you counteract prisons being used as economic development for poor rural areas?
So I'm so glad somebody asked that question, because one of the things I didn't really touch on, I think I should have at least briefly, is private prisons and how that really has affected things, particularly in the 90s, and really kind of sent the increase of the 80s into the final peak. And the private prison movement was a movement that really got kicking in the 1990s. It predates it a little bit, but it was the idea of several companies who ultimately became what in law we call real estate investment trusts. But what they did is they had a combination of lobbyists who would go to states, and this was during, times of like the late 90s, where frankly, there was just a great deal of anti-crime awareness. There was a lot more violent crime. We had periods of greater murders in cities. And so there was a great deal of awareness of this problem. And so what the private prison companies did is they first sent lobbyists to states, and they would say, okay, I'm such and such, I'm an expert on prisons. We've studied all this, and you know what? You need more prisons. You need to be putting people in prison much longer. Your sentences are way too short, and you're not sentencing some offenders that you need to. You need to increase the average sentence from, say, 5 years to 15. And then in the next breath, they would say, and luckily, my company just happens to do that. We just happen to build prisons. And the reason this became attractive to states is that what these guys would do is they would spec build these prisons in rural areas where wages were very low, and you had a big labor pool at low wage, and they would eat that cost, finance it, and then simply charge the state or the federal government or the locality a per diem rate. And it might be $30 a day, might be $50 a day for every inmate they house. And they would simply do a contract. Now, this looked really good to state legislatures in a lot of states because it meant they didn't have to appropriate money to build prisons, because who wants to do that? Even here in Wisconsin, if I had two politicians and one of them said, Brady, I know that the roads are really starting to crumble. I'm going to put some money in and fix that road by your house. And another one said, well, the prison yard at such and such is starting to crumble. I'm going to put some money into that. Which one is going to be more popular with me, right? So the private prison folks figured that out. And the problem for states, of course, is that it's the same thing as in our personal lives. Is it financially better to rent your house or own it? It's always own it in the end. And so renting inmate space always costs more in the long run. And these companies have made fortunes, one called CCA, which is now called Whack and Hut, another called Geo. And the way they do it is go into these rural areas and make them dependent. And of course, then you have political leaders in those areas that fight to keep those beds full, which keeps sentences up. So fundamentally, there are a couple of ways we found to deal with this problem. One of them is actually just forcing the standards of the private prisons to actually be up to public prison standards, because the way they make their money is cutting corners. It's not providing medical care when they should. It's providing not the food that they should. And back when I was at ACLU of Oklahoma, one of the largest facilities in the country was near Lawton, Oklahoma. Geo, the company, ran it. And it was unique because we were able to see an impact of this corner cutting that you usually don't. So for those of you who don't hang around a lot of prisoners, when you do, one of the things you find out is that kind of like those of us when all of us went to college, there's this thing called the freshman 15, the 15 pounds that you gain when you go to college. There's a similar concept in prisons. Prisoners' lifestyles tend to be sedentary. The diets tend to be not very nutritious and high in fats. And actually more carbohydrates. So people tend to gain weight. One of the things we found at Geo is that everybody lost weight, about 10 to 15 pounds. And when we started actually delving in, we found out literally it was because they weren't actually getting sufficient food. The company had simply figured out a way to cut corners and do various things to keep anybody from hearing about it most of the time. And for us to, in fact, find out about it, we ultimately had to go through people who, shall we say, were affiliated with groups like the Aryan Brotherhood and the Blood Gang. And those were the folks who ran the prison drug trade, which is another way that private prisons actually make their money, so to speak, because it allows them to pay lower wages to the workers, because the workers tend to supplement income with contraband. And so if you attack those things, you can make it less profitable, and often they will start kind of pulling back from that business model. The other thing that has happened big time in about the last 10 years is the companies saw writing on the wall a few years ago, because they figured out, even the states now understand, we can't afford this anymore. There's just not enough money. So many of these companies, instead of saying we're going to keep building more and more of these prisons, said, you know what, I'm going to put a little of that money into a probation office. I'm going to start becoming a probation provider. I'm going to start becoming a drug rehab provider. And you've seen this gradual diversification of these companies that has happened. And so far, I would say that's actually been the most effective thing to create this diversification. One problem it does not really solve, though, I think is the one at the core of that question, which is what do you do about this being a rural lifeblood? Because that's not just private prisons, it's public ones too. People don't build prisons in the middle of cities. They build them in rural areas because they want them out of sight and because they know there's a labor pool. And there is not an easy solution to that problem, I think, other than awareness, other than understanding what's happening at those facilities, and often actually fighting for the corrections workers themselves, because that's who is taken advantage of in some of those as much as anybody. And in some of the advocacy work I did in Oklahoma, often the people we were working with or representing was actually, some cases unionized, some cases not, but basically the prison workers. Even though in a sense we're fighting for the rights of the incarcerated, we're doing it working with the corrections officers because they had a vested interest in making it better too. They knew, they were being taken advantage of just as much.
Sharon asks, can you discuss recidivism? Is an offender more likely to be returned to prison sooner than someone committing the same crime? Is it different by race? Are there successful programs to reform?
I mean, it's hard to have really a coherent answer to that because it just varies so much across different kinds of crimes, different kinds of folks who offend, different places. I think some of the things that I would say is often recidivism rates vary incredibly wildly. For some crimes and communities, you'll see recidivism rates that are 80%. For others, I've seen rates as low as less than 10. And that variance has to do with a lot of things. If I approach that question from the perspective of working with individual defendants, like back when I was a prosecutor, if you do that very long, you quickly learn you get a sense of what keeps somebody from coming back. And in that micro environment, huge factors are family, opportunities, community support, proper things like mental health treatment. You have an inordinate number of people who are in and out of prison with serious mental health issues. Of those, you have an incredible number, often a majority, of folks who are in on drug offenses. The reason that they're having addiction troubles or got into drugs was some form of self-medicating for an underlying mental health problem. And I don't say that to say then that nothing should be about accountability or there's no harm, no foul. There are folks who have serious mental issues that commit serious crimes. But what I think we have really determined, those of us who have worked directly with them, is we know, okay, if you're going to have somebody coming back out of prison, if you're not talking about a life sentence or the death penalty, we know that having things like family and community support make an enormous difference. Just having a home to go to is massive. It's amazing how many folks come out of a prison and they're given a little bit of money, and sometimes there's a halfway house, sometimes there's not, and you don't really know where they're going. It's setting folks up with jobs. There was so many Methodist churches actually, or districts throughout the country, have what's called a criminal justice and mercy ministry or something similar. And one of the things that's operated, and I actually have not yet found out much about what's going on locally, and I need to, but I've worked in other places with groups. One of them is called Exodus House. And that's basically what they do is they start working with somebody when they're still on the inside to make sure when they come out, they've got a place to live. They start getting them job leads. They get them in an environment where there's some discipline, there's support, there are groups that meet and talk, there's no drugs, right? There's no gangs, that kind of stuff. And just try to help them stay out of that. So in the micro sense, we tend to know that those supports matter a great deal. In the macro, it's a lot harder. I would say that incarceration usually increases rather than decreases the recidivism for kind of obvious reasons, because you tend to have people coming out with worse problems than when they went in and fewer opportunities. And so that's one of the reasons too that you have a lot of folks like me running around who used to put people in jail and prisons and now tend to pay more attention to trying to get them out, because we've kind of seen over time, well, okay, yeah, there are times we've needed to do this, and there are people that I have helped send to prison that needed to be there, because that was what was necessary to protect them when they were in, to use Judge Walkley's categories, the folks we're afraid of. But there were also folks who were probably the ones we didn't know what else to do with. And those are the ones that I look at now and say, how do we do a better job there?
Lay asks, an unintended consequence of Wisconsin's truth in sentencing is that it removed incentives for good behavior, which used to lead to early release. Where does Wisconsin stand on that policy now, and how can we change it? You might want to start out with just explaining what truth in sentencing is for some people that don't know.
Yeah, so what it tends to be, it takes different forms in different jurisdictions, but the basic idea is that if your sentence is 10 years, you serve 10 years of calendar time, or in some cases 9 years or 8 years. And actually I did significant work on truth in sentencing back years ago at ACLU, and there in Oklahoma, that we called them 85% crimes, because it meant you had to serve 85% of your calendar sentence. And the reason that I would say what's in the question is actually a very common problem. It's one we identified too, that it takes away incentives, not just for good behavior, but for programs and participation in things like work training, treatment, all of these things, even things like 12-step programs or Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, stuff like that, is because people would get credits for those things. And so they would be able to then use those to shorten their sentence. And if you have a truth in sentencing system that then, didn't mean to do that, doesn't allow any credits, then it takes away that incentive. And there's actually another end of that can come into play too, that's even worse. And it's that in many prison environments, you actually don't have enough to go around, right? You don't have enough seats in those programs. You don't have enough places in a particular job training or a GED program or an associate's degree program. So you prioritize them. And of course, what's any prison going to do? Well, they're going to prioritize the person, the applicant, who can get credits for it and thus get out of the prison quicker, because it moves people through. So it's not just the incentive, it's also, it can actually affect availability. And I know what we started to see looking at those programs back in Oklahoma was, because there was so much limited access anyway, it basically meant that hardly anybody with these 85% crimes ever got into a good program, ever got into any training. And yet, in theory, they're the offenders that is probably most important to get in those programs, because they tend to be ones that are there for a little bit more serious stuff. So that's kind of the background. And to be honest, I have to confess, I don't know the latest developments on Wisconsin's. I wish I did. It's just one of those I haven't actually had to deal with up here. And so I just don't know the latest on it, where we are in that reform process. I know that's where things have been, but I have not kept up on if anybody has been able to actually turn that over yet. The way, for instance, we did at one point in Oklahoma, because it requires generally a couple of things. And one of the biggest typically is trying to change the prison regulations so that there are still ways for some kind of a credit system to exist within it. And often that can be things like security level, for instance, or commissary privileges or other things, and then making sure there's enough availability. So my apologies, I don't actually know the state of those reforms right now in Wisconsin, except to say that I actually want to, and I think anyone here, it's a good thing to look into, because it can make a substantial difference.
I thought that was actually part of the 53206 documentary, that we needed that system. But,
I think there is. I think that's right. I do think that's featured in there.
Mary asks, in the 70s, there was a court decision that made it much more difficult to commit someone to a mental institution. How many of the people with mental illness ended up being incarcerated?
I've seen statistics that range all over the place. I have seen stuff that says maybe 1 in 4 up to 2/3 or so. I have not ever seen one set of stats that seem to be definitive, right? And part of that is because so much of the facilities closures and changes happened over time, where it was very hard to really gauge, well, wait, who's really a new offender who would have gone here or would have gone there. I think what I would say my experiences definitely showed, though, or my observations, are that it's a substantial number. That if you're thinking about who would have been in a particular, if you do it from this direction, say who would have been in the mental health facility and where are those folks now, I think you're looking at half or more who tend to be either in prisons or in something that's essentially a prison mental health facility. And this is something that is exploded since that decision, actually, for obvious reasons. That, okay, so we know now that we do not have the same institutionalization mental health system, but that system can still legally exist within prisons. So once you have that person then convicted of the right crimes, instead of going to sort of a standard facility, or at least remaining there, they often end up in what's essentially the equivalent of a state hospital, mental health facility that's secure, but they're there officially as an inmate, in the same way that you would have an inmate who might be at a prison hospital for physical health issues as well.
Sandy asks, and we're running out of time, but I want to get this one in light of the murder of George Floyd and other Black people, police reform is being discussed nationwide. Can you speak to this issue?
So I think that, part of why I actually have not talked as much about policing really in this presentation is precisely because we're talking about it almost everywhere else. It's something that has really come to the forefront of the conversation. And I think if there's a takeaway I would want everybody to have, it's how much that has to be intertwined with reforms in other areas. Because ultimately, what the police work with is they're working under the system that has all of these larger flaws and feedback loops to it. And so even if you try to change particular things in policing, you're often not really going to change the full effect, just because you're trying to alter one part of a system over here, but you're not dealing with the others. The way I might liken that to is imagine you've got a car careening towards a brick wall and you say, gosh, we got to slam on the brakes. You don't slam on the brake. You don't have the brakes engaged on only one wheel. You want them to do preferably all four. That's kind of the problem I think that we often run into in reform of criminal justice, is very often there's a side of it we see at one time that becomes really visible. And it is certainly appropriate that policing is visible right now. But I think the challenge is actually not so much what do we do with that, it's actually how do we make that part of larger reforms. Part of what has happened for years in policing is a variety, I think of two key things. One is you've got kind of this idea of a police caste almost, of a much more closed society that has come together. And you have various things that tend to make police create a positive feedback loop in communities of color. So you do more policing in communities of color because you perceive that there's more crime, gangs, etc. Well, what happens? Of course, there are more arrests. There's more crime. So then that statistic comes out. You say, see, we're doing it right. And in fact, we've got to do more policing in that same community because that's where the crime is. One of the things that I think is most important to know when we're talking about policing is how it relates to one key aspect of the price of admission, shall we say, into the criminal justice system. What we would want that to be, what any of us want to think it is that if I want, so to speak, to become a convict, right? Well, I would go commit a crime. That's the thing that would determine whether I'm admitted into that system. Well, the reality is that's not the biggest determinative factor at all. So for instance, when I talked about things like marijuana usage rates versus arrests, the reality is that folks who have marijuana in their car and use it, maybe 1 out of every 20 of them will actually be caught. And so whether or not you're the guy smoking the marijuana matters a lot less than are you an African-American person driving around in a place where police want to pull you over because of your race and then find that marijuana. The determinative factor tends to be the policing more than it actually tends to be the crime. That's, I think, one of the aspects of policing reform that's actually most important, is not just things like how do we do training on implicit bias, how do we hold officers more accountable, but how do we deal with that positive feedback loop? that happens. And that's part of really a larger, frankly, more difficult conversation in how we perceive crime, because we tend to perceive crime along racial lines. We tend to often reflect prejudices. And it becomes things like the stereotype that especially was pervasive in the 90s, the young Black male, tough, scary offender. And people started having that image in criminal justice. And they say, aha, that looks like what we think a criminal looks like. But they'll take somebody who looks like me and say, that doesn't look like a criminal. It's our perception often. And so you can end up with a perception that a guy pulled over in an old car with a joint is a criminal. But for instance, I know we're running out of time, but one of the ways I'd illustrate that perception is one of my favorite, most ridiculous criminal justice stories from the last 10 years actually involves a bank called Wells Fargo and a giant conspiracy they had years ago where they opened up millions of fake accounts, committed massive amounts of identity theft, and basically to defraud people out of money, although not directly. What they did, and it was down to particular people at the vice president level who did it, authorized it, knew they were doing it, knew that every time they did it was a violation of 3 to 4 felony laws. And if you had actually incarcerated any one of them for all of those violations they were even known to have committed, and you take the average penalty, and it was about 10 years, and you added all that up, any one of them would have been incarcerated approximately 400 million years. Which, 400 million years ago, the Tyrannosaurus Rex didn't exist yet. We didn't even have most dinosaurs on the earth. That's how much crime these folks committed. If you want to quantify crime, none of them were ever prosecuted at all, because as a society, we don't tend to look at a white guy or a white lady in a business suit with a briefcase walking around Wall Street and think that's a criminal. We tend to have a mental image that's different. And that same mental image exists for police officers. And that's why we talk about that bias in policing. It's really that very big thing, but it comes down not just to what we're doing as a society, but what happens in that interaction that's repeated thousands of times a day between an officer and a person on the street.
I don't know if we have time for just this last question real quickly about, does the ability to find work post-incarceration vary by race? And is the fact that inmates are not receiving the vaccine as quickly as others, is that a human rights violation?
I tend to think it is, but I'll be honest, I don't have a completely easy solution for it either. There have actually been several calls in places to try to do temporary releases and things like that to create some social distancing in prisons, and kind of taking the vaccine question first. But one of the realities that's out there is that in jails and prisons, medical care generally, particularly preventative, has, in my experience, always lagged behind that of the general population. It's a reality of it for 2 reasons. And one is because simply you have a system where I have to, instead of just calling up the doctor, I may have to fill out 6 to 8 various requests to staff for assistance and go through multiple people at the prison before I can ever actually see a doctor. And that generally takes weeks or months. You see huge proportions of inmates with more severe medical issues, not because somebody technically denied them care, but because there was just so much of a process to go through. And, vaccine is kind of the same problem. It's, in a sense, you can argue that prisons are these closed environments where maybe you try to keep the virus out. And you also know that there's a limitation to how many people can be exposed, versus somebody in the general population who works in healthcare or a school. But at the same time, I think, when you categorically say, okay, as an inmate, it's not as important to vaccinate you or to care for you, it reflects a similar value judgment to the one we talked about with a murder victim, and who's, one who's white versus one who's Black. And I think that is very symbolic. One of the things I used to do as a prosecutor that actually set me apart from most of my colleagues, sadly, was I made it a point to really treat defendants with respect, even if they'd done pretty bad things, and treat them as a person, partially because what I was doing was basically trying to enforce an expectation that they behave like a person, that they, that somebody, here's a man, okay, you're supposed to behave like a man. You're supposed to be mature and disciplined and responsible for what you do. And when we make the kinds of judgments like the vaccine there and the delays, we tend to go against that. And ultimately, I think that can increase recidivism. What it also does, and this I think dovetails into the jobs question, is it functionally reduces opportunities for a couple of reasons. One is because we don't tend to actually put as many resources into those programs in facilities. Like I said, they're often wait lists, they're limited. But the other is there are places where, well, you'll hear about a campaign sometimes called Ban the Box that has to do with whether or not employers should even ask whether somebody has been incarcerated or been convicted of a crime or that sort of thing. And there are jobs that probably make a great deal of sense to cut people off of because of some convictions. Like you don't want somebody who's got a history of embezzlement working in a bank, for instance. You don't want somebody with a history of drug addiction working in a pharmacy necessarily. But where I think that breaks down is there are times where we have regulations that shut somebody out of a whole area of jobs for frankly not a lot of good reason, but simply because we tend to want to punish them more. And ultimately that tends to be counterproductive when we make that value judgment that they are a lower priority in some way.
Well, listen, we're over time. I have about 5 more questions, but we have to stop. Thank you, Brady, for another just excellent and thought-provoking presentation. This is really great.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Next Thursday, our series will conclude with a presentation by Pastors Matt Hadley and Dan Dick about the role that religion in America has played in perpetuating and combating racism. We hope that you'll join us for that last session. We're also discussing next steps, how we can continue the conversation and use the information that we've gained in this series to drive change. You'll hear more about that very soon. So with that, thank you for coming and have a good night.
Thank you much, everybody. Have a good night.
You too.